everybody, it's Jay Roby continuing on with my personal games, and in this game I was playing black against an opponent who was rated 1536 and I was rated 1587 at the time, and he opened up with pawn to e4 and I replied knight to f6, which is the Alekhine's defense, and my opponent pushed the pawn, which is by far the most played move in the position, although interestingly enough in a correspondence game the other day I had someone push the pawn to d3. Which was interesting because I very rarely see that move. I'm in a winning position in that game, but it was interesting nonetheless. So anyway, play continued here. Pushed the pawn up to e5. I swung my knight over to d5, and my opponent pushed the pawn up now to d4. This is a much more common move that I see when I use the Alekhine's defense. From here, I just pushed the pawn up now to d6, so preparing to chip away at white's center that I'm going to let white have. And white plays now pawn to c4, so it's almost getting into the four-pawn attack variation of the Alekhine's defense. So from here I swing my knight over to b6, and my opponent, instead of playing the pawn up to f4, which would be the four-pawn attack, my opponent decided to capture on d6, and I retook here with my e-pawn, and then my opponent brought his bishop up now to e3. So I took the opportunity just to continue on with development, just played my bishop up now to e7, and my opponent brought his other bishop up now to d3. So his bishops are right in the center of the board, or near the center anyway, and they're bearing down on these diagonals towards my potential castle position. But from here I just continue on with development. I played knight to c6, and then my opponent brought his knight up now to f3, and I took the opportunity to castle, and my opponent castled. And I wasn't too worried about castling, even though these bishops are bearing down here on my castle position. My queen is backing up the bishop along this dark square diagonal here, and I've got options, and these knights are going to be rerouted at some point in the future. Plus my light square bishop is also still able to access this light square diagonal, so it wasn't really a concern for me at the time. So from here I just swung my knight up now to b4, and I wanted to see if I could trade off the bishop for the knight. I knew it probably wasn't going to happen, but I also had eyes for possibly utilizing these squares here for pawn movements to kind of chip away furthermore at the center of my opponent. So it was just a flexible move, had a lot of options to it. My opponent, of course, saved the bishop, swung the bishop back down to e2, and I put my bishop now onto f5. So I've got a nice grab of that light square diagonal. My bishop is flexible. I can swing it back the same diagonal that I took it from. I could also snug it up here onto g6, possibly even up to h5 if I need to. So I like the bishop there. Also the knight, of course, is contributing to the influence here of the c2 square and the d3 square. So I felt that it was pretty good. In reply, my opponent swung his knight up now to a3. And I wanted to kind of avoid having this knight access the square here on b5, so I pushed my pawn up now to c6, so I took that jump point away from the knight. And another move that could have been played in this position could have been bishop to, say, for example, f6. But I felt that this knight was looking a little silly over here on a3. It was blocking the pawn on a2 from coming down to kick my knight. So I figured, you know what, might as well just take that jump point away right now and make him expend some moves to reroute that knight to a different location. And possible moves could include like pushing the pawn, or just simply rerouting the knight back to, say, b1 or even to c2. So I felt that it was a better move compared to bishop to f6. So from here, play continued. Now my opponent brought the queen down to b3. And from this position here, I simply push my pawn up now to a5. I want to maintain my knight on b4. I want to keep it there as long as I can. This queen isn't surely going to take it away because you're not going to give up a queen for a knight. So my opponent's going to either have to reroute the knight on a3 and attack this knight with a pawn, or give up the dark square bishop and attack the knight that way. So I want to keep my knight there as long as I possibly can. So from this position, my opponent played rook over to e1, and I played rook over to e8. Basically what I want to do is I want to start to get some control over that e file for when my bishop on e7 moves. But if I flip back a move, I think a better move in this position would have been to push up to d5. And when I was looking at the game in post-analysis, basically the play could have continued as followed. If my opponent pushed the pawn down now to c5 attacking my knight, I could swing my knight over to d7, and then if my opponent brought that dark square bishop up now lining up against this knight here on b4, I can just simply push the pawn up now to b6, and when my opponent recaptures, I can take back with the queen. Now I have the dark square bishop lined up with this knight here on b4, and I've got my queen, plus I've got the pawn here, so I've got three defenders on that knight. So from here, if my opponent were to, say, play bishop up to d3. I could just swing my light square bishop over to e6, and then if my opponent removes that knight now to c2 to make way for this pawn to come down and attack the knight here on b4, I can just take that light square bishop now with the knight. My queen is under attack, but it's defended by the knight, and once my opponent takes back that knight, I think it's a very workable position to be in. But nonetheless, I played rook to e8 in this position, and from here my opponent played rook to c1, and I could tell at the time that there was a little bit of pressure that's going to be building up here around the c5 square. So I redirected my knight from b6 and I put it over here onto d7, basically giving some more firepower to the c5 square. And from this position my opponent played knight over to b1, and I knew exactly what he wanted to do. Obviously, been waiting for it for a little while. He wanted to push his pawn up here to a3 to attack the knight here on b4. And now if I were to vacate the knight from b4, my pawn down here on b7 is weak and doesn't have a defender currently. So the move that I came up with to take care of that problem was rook over here to b8, and I figured that that would be a good way to defend the square for the short term on b7 once the pawn came down and I had to move off my knight. I'm going to flip back a move, though. I think a better move in that position when I was looking through it after the game was over would have been queen to b6. And it's kind of an interesting move because after here it lets white attack the queen by pushing the pawn up to d5. So this bishop here is attacking the queen, but black has the resource of playing a4 in this position, so attacking the white queen in return. So when white saves that queen, now we can swing the knight up now to c5, so it's blocking that bishop from attacking the queen. And then once white plays something like knight over here to c3, black can simply push the pawn up on the a file, get a little bit of control of that file, and from here play could continue as follows. White could take the pawn on c6, black could recapture, and then once that knight comes down, black can simply save the bishop by pulling it back to g6 and have a very playable position. I also liked how there was 4 knights surrounding this pawn here on c4. I thought that was pretty cool. But that's not what I played. I played obviously rook over to b8. So I just wanted to get my rook on the b file, get some influence along here, especially if this knight were to move or come under fire. I could push this pawn up at a later point and maybe get something out of that. But from here now, my opponent did play pawn to a3, so I swung my knight over to a6, and then my opponent played knight over to d2. And at this point of the game, I just wanted to play positionally sound as best as I could. I didn't want to be the first one to make a crucial mistake, so I played my knight up to f6 in this position. And my thoughts were that I just wanted to give my knight some more active squares to be able to jump to for potential outposts in the future. And I felt it was a better square for it to be on as opposed to d7. From here, my opponent played his queen over now to c3, and now I attack that bishop, the dark square bishop, with my knight. And the dark square bishop can only go to one square currently, and that's f4. So I just wanted to put some pressure on my opponent and make him react to my moves. So he put his bishop onto f4, and then I swung my knight back here to f6. Once again, throwing it back into my opponent's ballpark to see what he came up with. So from here, he played pawn up to b3, and I played my rook over now to c8. So basically, I want to give this file a little bit more power, just in case my opponent wants to try to open up access by pushing a pawn for his dark square bishop and his queen. So from here now, my opponent offers up a bishop trade, and I felt that this would be in my best interest to take this bishop off the table. I didn't want to have any kind of sacrificial attacks on my castle position, and I figured it'd be a good thing just to get those bishops off. So I went ahead and traded the bishop, and my opponent took back with his queen, and then I pushed the pawn up now to d5, basically opening up access for my dark square bishop. Now I'm attacking the pawn here on a3, so my opponent has to do something about that. My opponent from here just pushed the pawn down to c5, and in this position I played my knight up to h5. I think a little bit better than knight to h5, however, would have been knight to c7. And play could continue as follows: h3, and then I can put my knight here onto e6, and then once my opponent saves that dark square bishop, I'm in a very playable position. Now I can do something with my dark square bishop without having to worry about trading rooks right off the bat. But nonetheless, that's not what I played. I played my knight over to h5, attacking the dark square bishop, and my opponent placed his bishop on now to d6. Now this is the first big mistake in the game, because if I play this properly, I can win a pawn in this position and come out quite a lot better than my opponent. So it's actually perfectly fine to go ahead and take that bishop, which is what I played. Then my opponent took my rook, putting me in check, so I had to take back with the queen, and then my opponent retook the bishop here on d6. Now I can win that pawn if I play it properly, but unfortunately I made the poor move, queen to d7. And this just begs for the knight to come down now to e5, and it's attacking the queen, and so I have to get my queen to safety. Now, by far better a move than what I played would have been just to put the queen here onto e6, and that kind of does a couple of things. First of all, it stops this queen from coming down to f5 and causing a lot of problems. Unfortunately, though, in the position, I decided just to take the pawn on d6, and this just begs for queen to come down to f5. And if you want, go ahead and pause the video and just try to figure out all the troubles that I have to face in this position. But basically, queen to f5 is doing like three big tremendous things. First of all, it's attacking the knight that's unprotected on h5. Secondly, it's attacking the pawn now on f7, supported by the knight, and the pawn doesn't have any other defenders. And finally, it's also attacking the undefended rook on c8. So I played the only move in the position that could salvage things for myself, and I swung my rook over to f8. I had to protect this pawn, I had to save the rook. But in the process of doing so, of course, my knight falls on h5. Now what I did to, try to salvage the situation as best as I could is I just took the pawn now on a3, attacking the rook on c1, threatening checkmate. But the short end of the story is, I'm down a pawn. I have two enemy pawns and my opponent has a minor piece, so I'm definitely not in a good position. And all of this could have been avoided very easily by going through this a little bit differently. So in this position, after my bishop falls, I missed the very nice move, knight to f4. And what this is doing is it's attacking the enemy queen, of course. So the queen can save herself by going to f5, but then I have a nice check here on e2, so I can check the king. I'm actually forking the king and the rook in this position, but it turns out that I don't want to take the rook here, and I'll show you why. So after the king moves from being in check, if I were to take that rook now, white has a very nice move, pawn to d7, and I'm in trouble again. So much better instead, after landing the check here, would have been just to play pawn up to g6, attacking the queen, and when the queen saves herself, moving the rook over now to d8, and I can win that pawn. So I totally missed that. I got way too greedy and took the pawn on d6, and of course that led to the carnage that you see here, and dropping the knight. And even though I have two pawns, my opponent definitely got the better end of the deal. So from here, my opponent swings his queen down to d1 to prevent me from taking the rook, and I play my knight up now to b4. Basically, my goal at this point, after feeling a little bit of frustration, was to coordinate my pieces as best as possible and try to attack the enemy pawns to win back some material. So my opponent placed his knight now on f3, and I swung my rook over to a8. And the general goal that I had was, just to start ripping things up here on the a file and see what I could make happen. But from here, my opponent played a pretty bad mistake, and he played knight to g5. And I'm not too sure exactly what my opponent was thinking. Maybe he was thinking he'd have a couple attackers here on f7. Maybe he can bring his queen down and support. I'm not too sure what my opponent was thinking, because this just basically lets me thrust f6 forward like a Spartan spear. And there's nothing my opponent's going to be able to do to stop one of those knights from dropping. He tried to delay it. He played rook over to a1. I just swung my queen over to b2. And then he played rook to b1, and I just put my queen now onto c2. And then he tried to peel off one of the knights, but I just took the queen with check, and when he recaptured, I took up that knight here on e5. So it was a pretty big mistake. Let me get back into the game. And then once he recaptures, now I'm a pawn ahead in the position instead of being a pawn behind. So from here now, I play rook over to e8, attacking the knight. He places the knight now onto c5, attacking my pawn. I just push that pawn up, attacking the knight, and then he puts his knight now onto d7, and I just push up that pawn now to b5. So this knight is pretty much not really accomplishing hardly anything in that particular square on d7. So from here now, he pushes his pawn up to f4 to give another defender here to the pawn on e5. I place my rook now onto e7, attacking the knight, and the knight peels off now to c5. So from this position, one of my goals was that I wanted to get the knight over here on b4 a lot more active, and I wanted to get the knight coordinating with the rook if possible, to start attacking some pawns. So what I did after my opponent played his knight over to c5 is I played my knight up to c2, and the general goal is I'm going to spend a couple moves getting my knight over onto this side of the board, and because this position over here is very solid, I don't really have to worry about that for the time being. So from here my opponent played his pawn forward to e6, allowing the knight to act as a defender, and I played my pawn up now to g6. Basically, if my opponent brings his pawn down, I want to be able to take it. So from here, my opponent attacks my knight with the rook by putting his rook onto d2, and I just swing my knight over now to e3. So I'm getting closer to getting that knight on that side of the board. From here, he plays his king up now to f2, and I hit a check. His king peels off now to g3, and I place my knight on a nice square f6. So my knight is getting a little bit more dangerous in this position. It's definitely a lot more dangerous than it was when it was sitting back here on b4. So from here now, my opponent plays pawn to h4, and if you want, go ahead and pause the video, but my opponent made a big mistake. One of the reasons why I put my knight here onto f6 was because this is a nice forking square here on e4. Unfortunately, though, this knight over here on c5 is defending that square, but there's a nice little tactical shot you can do here to win a pawn, and that's simply rook takes pawn here on e6. And of course, if knight takes, then this knight here can fork the king and the rook, so basically wins a pawn in the position. So basically facing that, my opponent resigned. I think he felt that being down 2 pawns at this point in the game was too much. So it was definitely an interesting game. Like, there was some mistakes, obviously. I was very fortunate that my opponent played his knight over to g5. But like, I mean, it reminds me of that quote from Garry Kasparov. He said, I think it was along the lines of, if we won, most likely it's because our opponent made the last mistake. And that was definitely true in this game. I made the first mistake, even though I shouldn't have. I should have been able to win that pawn, but then my opponent made the second one, and it was the last mistake in the game. Well, actually, and then he made this one here with the fork tactic. But like, I mean, you know, that's how it goes sometimes. And this video now, I'm one more video away from being caught up with my game database, so I can start playing standard time control games and have the videos correlate directly to the game. And I'll be posting every game that I play. I know I've been posting videos quite frequently this last 2 weeks, but I really want to get caught up while I'm on holidays, so that moving forward I can get back to you know, doing the odd standard game, and then as well posting videos on the other things that interest me about chess and what I'm studying. So take care, hope you enjoy the video, and we'll see you next time.